Welcome to the Western Bell podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled, Is Suffering Necessary? The talk was given by Matthew Files on June 6, 2026 via Zoom. Matthew facilitates groups that support people to look deeper into their process, formulate their own questions, and become responsible for their choices. In this presentation, he notes that incarnation is suffering, since we suffer the illusion of identification and don't know our true nature, who we really are. He talks about luxury suffering, a term coined by the spiritual teacher Lalita, which drains our energy and is something that we can do something about. Matthew brings considerations of teachers, including Jan Cox, George Gurdjieff, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Da Frijan, Trokton Rinpoche, and Lee Lozowick into the discussion. Part of the talk involves interactions with attendees about different perspectives from which to relate to suffering on the spiritual path. The talk begins with the song Corner on the Rain by the blues band Shri. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Matthew Files.
Something that I felt would evoke the mood of suffering. Get the talk off to the right start.
Before the world dries up, better not leave me alone. Only you can stem the tide. I've been crying over you, weeping in such pain. I've cried so many tears, got a corner on the ring. Tears ain't stopped in so long, living in a flood. Tears flow like a river, soon I start crying blood. I've been crying over you, weeping in such pain. I've cried responsibility. Help me stop these endless tears. You have got to heed this plea. I've been crying over you, weeping in such pain. I've cried so many tears, got a corner on the rain, got a corner on the rain. I've cried so many tears, got a corner on the rain, got a corner on the rain.
Okay. It's the blues, you know? That's what the blues is about, suffering. At least blues I listen to, about our human troubles. So is suffering necessary? I have no idea. That's kind of a philosophical question, probably infinitely debatable, given the right minds coming together in the same room at the same time. Could go on forever. But I do know that suffering is. Whether it's necessary is something else, but it is. And we're all in the same boat because, according to the Buddha, all life is suffering. So there you go. End of the talk. All life is suffering. But there are aspects of suffering that may not be necessary. So there's a term coined by Lalita Thomas, a spiritual teacher in the Western Bowl tradition. And she has this term, luxury suffering. It's a great term. One way she defines it is saying that self-observation with judgment is luxury suffering. That's like kind of a summary of her phrase, luxury suffering, because it pertains to so many things that we have judgments about ourselves. And all that is luxury suffering. Do we need to live in that kind of luxury? So I would call that unnecessary suffering. It is, we do it, but is it really necessary to live there, to stay in that kind of suffering? We think about self-observation without judgment. And usually I do anyway, think, yeah, well, we're talking about negative judgment, right? Not necessarily. Could be positive judgment too. I'm doing really well. My practice is on the mark. God loves me. Whatever we happen to be feeling at the time. I'm so compassionate because I helped this person out, or whatever. Those positive things we say to ourselves, either up front or in the background, we're still saying it to ourselves somewhere along the line. To me, that fits into the same category of self-observation with judgment. I made this comment before the talk started. Somebody had said that suffering was their thing. And I said, it's not my thing. I avoid suffering like the plague, but it's everywhere. And even trying to avoid it is suffering. The longer I try to avoid it, or the more I try to make it better. You know, the end of suffering. Why would you want to end suffering, your own suffering, except maybe your luxury suffering? That would be good to bring to a screeching halt. But most of us, I think, have been on some kind of a spiritual path long enough to realize that screeching halt isn't going to happen anytime soon. If it hasn't happened yet, it's going to be a slow wearing away of everything that keeps that luxury suffering in place. So I was thinking one of the things that keeps suffering in place, luxury suffering in place, is the news, whether it's online or on the paper, in magazines. And we go out there and we're just totally ripped up by everything that's happening in the world, just torn to shreds. But we don't stop going there. We keep going back. Give me more. Show me more suffering of the world. Let me see how bad it is in the Ukraine or in the Gaza Strip or wherever. But do we really have to go there? Like if we weren't connected to the world like that through the news media, and we all are, would we really have the same sense of the state of the world that we have through watching news, listening to news? I don't think so. And we might actually be more aware of the suffering that's closer to us, like our own and the people around us, because everybody's suffering. But for some reason, it really grabs us when it's in the extreme example of bombings and wars and dictators and fascism and all that cool stuff in the news these days. That's always been in the news forever. And even though we tend to see more of it because we're connected by the internet and we can see it instantly anywhere, I'm not necessarily sure that the world's in any kind of a worse state than it's ever been in terms of suffering, in terms of the suffering in people. I say people, I guess animals suffer. I mean, they suffer pain, but I'm not talking about pain. I had a root canal this week. Oh man, that was bad. Before the root canal was all like, my eye hurt, my ear hurt. Oh man, it was really, that's nothing. That's not suffering. That's just pain. My relationship to the pain is suffering. How I relate to the pain. But the pain itself is just pain. These little definitions I've come across about suffering. Wanting to only feel good stuff while feeling it all. Or things not being the way we want them to be tends to create suffering in us. The lack of acceptance of the here and now becomes problematical, which is suffering. This is a quote from one of my favorite teachers, writers, Jan Cox. He says, there are two classes of pain, that which your nervous system silently relays as physical, and that which verbally translates as things should have gone otherwise. Jan Cox, he makes this distinction between troubles and problems. And he says, troubles are not the same as problems. Problems threaten your physical well-being. Troubles bother your mind. Problems can be solved. Troubles only dealt with, as it is called. The more head-oriented you are, of greater significance seems troubles, even to the point of primacy over problems. Most people reading this have no problems, only troubles. Starving, homeless, ill, and besieged refugees have problems. The obvious original purpose of troubles was to be a tool to deal with problems. To mentally trouble over a lack of water for your fields could lead you to suddenly picturing the digging of irrigation ditches from a nearby river. But when you are not faced with any such actual problems, in what activity does your mind's ability to be troubled engage? When no lion is in sight, gazelles will stand around bitching and complaining about sports, politics, declining moral values, and just generally running the numbers on one and all. I like his sense of humor. So when we have troubles, our troubles are our suffering. Problems are real problems. The homeless, the ill, and besieged refugees. Yeah, they got problems to figure out. We don't have problems because we live in luxury. So we have luxury suffering. If you look around, you may be poor in this country, but if you get a bigger scope on the picture, we live in luxury. So our suffering is going to be luxury oriented in terms of all the little things, all the things that trouble us about ourselves and about others. Oh, yeah. So then there's intentional suffering, a term I believe used by Gurdjieff. One of the best means of rendering ineffective the predisposition present in your nature of the crystallization of the consequence of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, don't ask me what Kundabuffer is, I have no idea, is intentional suffering. And the greatest intentional suffering can be obtained in your presence if you compel yourself to be able to endure the displeasing manifestations of others towards yourselves. So there's that kind of suffering taken on intentionally, on purpose, to allow ourselves to be at the effect of whatever someone else is putting out towards us, whatever animosity they happen to be pushing our way, whatever attitude they happen to be pushing our way, is to allow ourselves to be at the effect of that. That's big work, but it's also beginning work. Because if we're pushing away that, if we're not able to be with that, we're going to push away all kinds of suffering that we see around us. And one way of doing that is just by ignoring it. It's a form of denying the suffering of the world, we could say. And I personally, it's an interesting thing because I personally don't have much connection to the suffering of the world in a large sense, except what I see day to day. I'm a windows cleaner, so I'm in and out of people's houses all day long. And people suffer. Everybody's suffering. It could be a defense mechanism, but I don't care. Like I can see it, but I can't fix it. Nobody can fix somebody else's suffering. Nobody can get somebody else to end their own suffering. Just not possible. Best we can do is maybe inspire each other to work a little harder, dig a little deeper, relax a little more. But personally, I really don't understand the disposition to be troubled by other people's troubles. Some people seem to be disposed that way, to be troubled by other people's troubles. Maybe I have no empathy. But I find myself untouched. When Rabbi and I were talking at dinner, and she says, "You worried about your talk tonight?" I said, "Yeah, kind of." I said, "I'm worried about offending people by poking fun at suffering, particularly the luxury suffering." I mean, that's really what I'm talking about here, is the kind of suffering that we can actually do something about in ourselves. The kind of suffering that basically just drains our energy, like worrying about how we're going to pay the rent, that kind of thing. That's luxury suffering and all the emotions entailed in that. Oh, here's another tip on suffering from Jan Cox. If you truly enjoy suffering, just open your mouth. You ever sit around with a bunch of old people and have an organ recital? You know what I mean by an organ recital? It's like, oh, yeah, I got this back pain and oh, my shoulder, or I got this liver problem, or, talking about our organs. And everybody goes, oh, yeah, that's so hard. That's so terrible. That's all the luxury suffering that occupies our mind and emotions. That's the kind of thing that comes out of our mouths very often, unconsciously, just kind of slips out. Trungpa, of course, he has a thing or two to say about suffering because he's a Buddhist. The student asks him, "Can you explain again what you mean by suffering?" Trungpa Rinpoche, "The idea of suffering here is the thingness in us, which is very lumpy and slightly inconvenient. It is the awkwardness in us, which is not very nice or pleasant or flowing. There is something that is in the way that doesn't allow us to be free-flowing. There's a vast thing that is in the way somewhere. That's the fundamental suffering. It's not particularly painful on the ordinary sense of physical pain, but it is in the way. It stops us from flowing in that sense suffering could be regarded as synonymous with the idea of a hang-up. I don't know, I read that and I go, yeah, I can relate to that thingness, that lumpiness, that awkwardness. It's kind of the awkwardness of being a human being, the weirdness of interacting with human beings because you don't know what you're doing it for. I find human life very awkward and uncomfortable because I don't know what to do with people. I see people, I visit people, but I don't really know what to do with people. Sit down and have a kind of conversation. It's like, why are we having this conversation? I have no idea. So there's that awkwardness. There's a sense of not knowing what the hell's going on here. It's a background thing. That's what he's talking about here. It's a background thing. It's not upfront pain like having a root canal. Actually, the root canal was not bad. Having a root canal done was relatively painless. That's why I had it done, because of the pain. I suffered with that for about a week. I was like, I'm done. As much as I hate root canals, because I've had many of them in my day, and they all failed. Every single one of them within probably 5 or 6 years. Had to have the tooth pulled anyway. But here I am having another one. I figured I might as well save it because I don't have that many left. So that's Trungpa. Now I want to read something else. So this is one of my all-time favorite pieces of writing about suffering. It's by Da Frijan. And he says, we chronically consider our individuation, our birth, our mere bodily existence to be a form of separation. We use events such as coming out of the womb and the conflicts of childhood to elaborate this fundamental philosophical point of view. The inherent vulnerability of our apparently independent existence is a shock. We reflect on all experience, even most primitive movements in the womb, as a kind of rejection. When we look out into the universe, we feel insulted, rejected, unloved, and so we make philosophy out of our apparent independence. Thus, the primal event of suffering is not some circumstance that happens to us. It's not an event within our objective experience. It's not something that we conceive to exist in relationship to us or over against us. The primal event of suffering is us. Our suffering is not recognized as separation from something else in particular. It is our own appearance, our own independent existence, and we interpret this present event as separation on that basis. That interpretation is our first philosophical gesture, the first time we say or feel, you don't love me. So this thing about the primal event of suffering is us. Incarnation. It's not an event. The primal event of suffering is not something that happened to us, except we incarnated. That's it. And everybody suffers that. And then we identify. We build our psyche, our personality on top of that and assume these wonderful personas and suffer all through it because we identify with the name, the body, everything that I take to be me. That kind of suffering that is easily challenged, but we can spend a lifetime unraveling that mess. Here's another little piece. I just came across this the other day. Not directly related to suffering. I don't even know if she uses the language of suffering in here, but I really liked it. Like I connect dots that are not necessarily linear dots, but they connect for me. And I hope they connect for you. This was a piece written by, this woman who I've been reading a lot of her stuff online, Tanya Diamond. She's a tantric teacher. She says, you've probably spent years trying to understand yourself. Trust me, I know, because I did too. I could tell you exactly where my anger came from, trace scarcity back through memory, like an archaeologist brushing dust from old bones, explain every wound. I understood my patterns deeply. Awareness feels astonishingly similar to transformation, and that confusion keeps many people trapped for years. But awareness and transformation are not the same thing. Modern personal growth spaces, if we're being painfully honest, often become places where people gather to become exquisitely educated about their limitations. They know their attachment style. They understand their father wound, can name their trauma responses, explain their scarcity coding, describe their nervous system patterns with startling precision, and yet find themselves living the same lives, dating the same dynamics, shrinking in the same moments, abandoning themselves in eerily familiar ways. You can understand scarcity for 20 years and still undercharge. I had to laugh at that one because I still undercharge in my business. And that whole piece I read before about Da Friedjon is about scarcity. It's about the context of scarcity, of unlove. You can understand abandonment and still betray yourself to avoid discomfort. You can understand relationship dynamics and still choose chemistry that wounds you because familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar peace. You can sit in a workshop on Saturday, cry through a profound realization, swear everything is changing, and by Tuesday, find yourself repeating the exact same pattern, wearing slightly better language. The brain quietly plays tricks here because realization creates reward. Insight gives you dopamine, the rush of recognition, that holy feeling of, oh my God, this explains everything, gives the nervous system the sensation of progress. The mind, endlessly efficient and occasionally lazy, loves to mistake understanding for completion. This phrase she has in there, oh my God, this explains everything. I spent a long time looking for something that would explain everything, and it just isn't there. There's nothing that explains everything. And this whole thing about understanding, back to my good friend Werner Erhard, quote from him saying, understanding is the booby prize. That's what she's talking about. Understanding all this stuff about us is the booby prize, because you can understand forever and nothing happens. Nothing changes. And at the same time, attempting to change is a kind of suffering. All the efforts we put into changing, to being different, is a kind of suffering. And it's not about putting effort into changing. Maybe it's just a matter of relaxing and allowing things to happen rather than trying to make things happen. I hope nobody, I really do. I really hope nobody came here for answers, because the best thing I can do here is present things to think about, things to consider. But answers? Phew, I don't know.
I had experience. I was an in-home caregiver for a very long time, and probably one of the best teachers I had about suffering was someone that I cared for who was quadriplegic. But he was a doctor. When he had his accident, he had to rely on people. He had to change a lot of things. He had to learn how to tell when he needed to pee by his blood pressure. He did that for many, many years. But he was busy helping other people. And at one point I said to him, well, can I write a book about you? Would you tell me about your experience? He said, why would you want to do that? And I said, to inspire people. He never let me get off of that one. It really showed me how I was trying to do something to make myself feel better about this situation that he was in. And he was having none of it. None of it. It was like he was not letting me off the hook at all. He never did. But I really learned something. He was not going to suffer. He just wasn't. He was too busy to suffer. I was a night nurse for him. So he would have the hospital call him in the middle of the night if one of his patients had died. He said, I want to know as soon as somebody dies because I need to call the family right away. And he would wake up out of his sleep and do that. He had his priorities, and it did not have to do with his own condition. So there's a very big difference between the circumstance of your condition and what you're calling suffering. He knew nothing about spiritual work. I learned a lot about trust and a lot about care. What is real care and what is it that I'm doing so that I can feel better? In fact, all of the people that I took care of taught me some things about what it is you're speaking to tonight.
Thanks.
Thanks for being messy. Everything you're talking about is really messy. And I really appreciate just being truthful about that.
Well, I think we're just talking about life.
Yeah.
Which is messy, all aspects of it. it doesn't fit well in a box.
I don't think the subject lends itself to black and white answers. I mean, you were saying that the news keeps luxury suffering in place. Do you think that spiritual practitioners should avoid the news? For me, I think it's addiction to the news that's the problem.
Well, when I was talking about that, I just don't understand people who go and watch the news and are devastated by what they see, but they keep going back to see it. That is beyond my capacity to understand. And I think there's a racket going on there.
I mean, I do get that there's a hook, that it captures my attention, and that I need to make some boundaries with myself about that. But to avoid that entirely, I'm suspect about that also.
Yeah, I'm not talking about avoiding it entirely. I'm talking about when you're driving down the road and there's this 3-car crash where one of the cars just got mauled by a semi and there's dead people hanging out of the cars and you drive by it. Are you going to turn around and drive by it again? But that's the news.
Yeah, but I think that avoiding the suffering of the world doesn't work for me. I feel like there's compassion that is an intrinsic quality.
If you go into Safeway, you can't avoid the suffering of the world. You don't have to turn on the news to see the suffering of the world. No need for it.
Okay. Another thing that occurred to me was this idea of intentional suffering, of enduring the displeasing manifestations of others.
Yeah.
Like, how do you discriminate about what situations to allow to impact you and to disturb your mind, and those situations to avoid, and certain people to avoid?
Why would you avoid people? I mean, we all have our preferences of people who we like to hang out with or not. But I think that's a little different. The unpleasant manifestations of others could be, just somebody in a supermarket and they're wanting to cut ahead of you in line. Or it could be the person you're sitting down to breakfast with.
I just don't know about avoiding anything, really.
Yeah.
Yet, I think that some discrimination is needed.
Yeah, I do too. Because I do believe there are toxic environments.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you would speak to this subject of the broken heart, if you can relate to that. Because for me, as you're talking about suffering and experiencing the suffering of other people or not, or feeling the suffering of others or not, that phrase is coming up for me as something that I want to cultivate. And I don't know what your understanding of that is, or if you can speak to that.
To the broken heart?
And how that relates to your subject.
I'm not sure how it relates to the subject, because I don't know if I have such a great reference point for a broken heart. So I'm not sure that I can speak to that. The first thing that came up when you used that term was more of a sadness, not because of how things are in the world in terms of the events happening in the world, but because for the most part, people don't know who they are. So we suffer the illusion of me-ness. That's how I relate to it. That suffering, to me, the suffering of not knowing our true nature, that's like the bottom line suffering. And that influences everything. That influences how we move through life. That not knowing. In that piece that I was reading from Da Friedjon, that's what he was talking about. We want to put our suffering on an event, something that happened to us, in our childhood, so we can go to therapy and fix it. But we can't. You can't fix that. It's not fixable. Yeah, so the brokenheartedness, I don't know. I might be too tough for that. Tough in the sense of jaded.
Yeah. I have a friend who's younger than me, of course, and she's just immobilized in pain 24 hours a day. And there's nothing that can be done except to sit there, witness, and bless. And for me, that doesn't have anything to do with her true nature, for her not accepting her true nature or whatever. But for me, that's deep suffering. And I suffer what I would call the broken heart because of my love. That love creates a resonance with her in which I'm helpless in the face of that, and I love her. So for me, that's one example of how the broken heart shows up in my life.
Right.
It's deep pain and it's deep suffering.
Yeah. That is not luxury suffering. Just to be clear.
That incarnation is suffering.
Yeah.
And the question for me is, how does that get transformed? If there is such a thing as transformation, what is that? And how does that happen? And I'm thinking about a couple sections in this book, The Essential Swami Ramdas, and they're titled Suffering is Essential for the Evolving Life. And suffering and sacrifice soften the heart of man. And pain and sorrow purify your heart. And when it's not luxury suffering, it does seem that we have a natural empathy for the suffering of others. And that being able to feel something beyond myself, it feels like it's transformative when I feel for another person, but not in a.
It feels like what?
It feels like it's transformative to me. Not if it's idiot compassion, but if I see someone and can only witness and bless, or can only pray for them. I do a grief group with people who have experienced the loss of children and deep loss in their lives. A couple people. And that has changed them forever, that kind of suffering. And that seems to me to be unavoidable, some kind of suffering. We don't know what form that will come in our lives. But oftentimes people just despair.
Right.
What to do with that, become alcoholics.
Yeah.
But to have some faith that there is something, some intelligence that's moving the whole process and leading us to surrender. For me, it's helpful. And I just feel like having compassion and having some feeling for the suffering of others is an intrinsic part of the path.
I tend to agree with you. I mean, it's more academic than anything else, just based on reading things very similar to what you were just saying. But I don't want to know other people's pain. I don't want to know their suffering. I just, like, that's their business.
I think some things are sometimes just too big to handle by oneself, at least until one reaches a place on the path where one can do that.
I'm not sure that I have that choice to not be at one with the suffering of another. For whatever reason, I don't think it was a conscious choice to do it. And I don't think it's a conscious choice anymore that I can't do it, that I'm not involved anymore, because the work of the path, at least for me, has been towards greater immersion in the one. So in that respect, I don't think I have much choice anymore as far as feeling the suffering or caring about the suffering of others. I think it's just part of reality for me.
I don't think we cannot. I mean, if you see something tragic happen, like an accident on the road, and you see the people that were harmed, I think our bodies naturally respond to that. Like the body responds to another person's suffering. It just does. That's what I think.
I would tend to agree with that. And then I just move on to the next thing.
How about when something happens to you?
Oh, that stays forever. How do you mean? Like when something happens to me?
Yeah, like if there's a tragedy that happens to you. To me, my experience is that it's not so easy to just move on to the next thing.
I don't know yet. I've never had big tragedy in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Knock on wood. So I don't know how I would be in the face of big tragedy.
By the way, I just would like to say that there are some people here at this talk who have really experienced big tragedy.
Do you really feel that you just move on to the next thing?
For the most part, yeah. Particularly the kind of example you were talking about, like a car accident on the side of the road. But yeah, actually, for the most part, I do. And when I don't, I'll just keep running things through my brain like a loop. And I keep thinking about it. And to me, that's just a bad habit. Running things, continuing this loop.
I thought maybe I would refer to Trungpa.
Yeah.
Someone asked him, do you ever find yourself in the hell worlds?
Yeah, right.
And he said, well, yes, I do. And then the questioner said, well, what do you do about it? And he said, I stay there as long as possible. So I wonder about that. I don't know what he meant by it, but there's an unconscious suffering that comes, I think, in avoiding the truth of something that's painful. I'm just wondering for him what he meant. And for me, there's an even greater suffering that comes from not being aware.
I'm not being aware of suffering.
I live in this very large brick building that takes up a whole city block, and it's beautiful. And there's a courtyard, and many people come to have their graduation pictures taken and their wedding pictures. And there's this superficial kind of glee and happiness. But I witnessed that they're suffering so deeply, they don't even know it.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of in the conversation. I don't have any conclusion.
I think what you're bringing up is significant, that Trungpa quote, because of the possible transformational value of suffering. And when we push it away, we basically deny ourselves that possibility of transformation, of being so deeply wounded or heartbroken that we're different on the other side. You must know that famous passage in Stephen Jenkinson's book where Brother Blue is talking about the elephant man. And Brother Blue came out and was deeply suffering. And Stephen said to him something like, are you okay, man? He said, yeah. He said, that play caused me to suffer so deeply, and I never want that type of suffering to end.
You mentioned two kinds of suffering. In Buddhism, or one strain of Buddhism, they've spoken about there's three kinds of suffering. And I think people have been talking around that. I mean, you have the suffering of pain when your tooth extraction or somebody you love dies. Then there's a suffering of identity, which is what mostly you have been pointing at. And then there's, I don't know if this is the right term, but I'll call existential suffering that other people have been pointing out or talking around that, which is seeing the needless suffering of people around you. And I think Trungpa mentions, not just Trungpa, other teachers, a kind of continuous sadness. I don't have the right words for it, but it's something like that. I think the closest you came to mentioning is just go to Safeway and you see everybody suffering. And if you don't buffer yourself from it, there's a kind of deep sadness that it's all needless. And yet so many people are in this state.
This point about superficial happiness, I don't judge it to see people who are happy in the moment, celebrating something that is temporary. I mean, it's wonderful to celebrate an event that is a happy event. It just seems to me that to really be happy, one has to be with the circumstance that's happening and also to realize that everything changes. Suffering is involved when we try to make things last forever or in denial of the fact that they're not going to last forever. I mean, whatever it is.
Yeah, the denial of impermanence.
Yeah, but it's possible, I think, to be fully happy in the moment if one accepts the reality of impermanence.
I can't speak to that from personal experience.
Yeah, right. This is more like understanding is the booby prize. However, I think that we get to work with that on the path because that keeps occurring.
Right. I had another little thing I wanted to read here. This is from an introduction to a book by Lee Lozowick, A Tale Told by an Idiot Full of Sound and Fury. And the introduction is by Troktung Rinpoche. And he says, I love reading Lee because he is compassionate, but most definitely not nice. The word compassion is made of two parts, calm, meaning together, and passion. These days, most have forgotten the root of the word passion. It means to suffer, to endure. Compassion is to endure the suffering of beings together with them, even if you were free to do something like lay on a beach and enjoy the sunshine. Trungpa Rinpoche would sometimes call a person nice, and as he said the word nice, he would have a look of utter disgust on his face, as though he had just eaten a bad peanut. Lee is not nice. A compassionate person often appears not nice because it is not our suffering that clings to us, but is we who cling to our sufferings, much the way Gollum clung to his precious. I like that. I think that's true. Well, there's several things in there that are true. One is that I think there's this general idea that compassion has to have a nice face to it, and it doesn't. And the other thing is the clinging to our suffering, really as a facet of our identity, of who we take ourselves to be, how much I suffer or how little I suffer. Either way, doesn't matter. It's like we cling to it. We hold on to it. Like many other things, it's definitely not the only thing we hold on to reinforce this sense of me-ness. But since we're talking about suffering, it's definitely a thing that can just be added to the layers of who we take ourselves to be, just thrown on the pile. And yeah, that's me too, rather than like burning the pile down instead, like a yajna fire. All the things we've piled up to keep us believing the same stories about ourselves.
There seems to be a lot of, admiration for people who suffer for a cause.
Yeah.
I don't know. Something seems missing to me. Something seems awry.
Okay, fill it in.
No, I'm just not sure. I think you're talking about things that are self-referential, right? Loops, like thought loops.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like there's some profound link not being touched upon, but I just don't know what that is.
Oh, I bet you do.
Well, I would venture to say that when you admit that you have not had tragedy in your life, that may be what is lacking in the way in which you're presenting this, because there are many people who have related to that. Not to say you haven't been blessed and fortunate in that, but to speak about suffering without knowing that. I mean, I know I can know that as an intellectual concept as far as working with my mind, but until a grief that broke my life was presented to me, I don't think I could have spoken about it. So I'm wondering if that may be the piece that may be missing in some of what you're saying.
What do you think?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I think I'd need your help too to answer that question.
What do you need?
When I say I'd have to ask you, I don't know. I just don't know people who are untouched by tragedy, by life.
Yeah, I mean, I've never had a loved one close to me die. Never had a child die or a spouse die or anything like that. Those kinds of tragedies, personal, big things. It's never happened to me. And you were saying, oh, maybe you're fortunate. But then somebody was talking earlier, maybe I was reading about the value of suffering. So maybe I'm really missing out on something, on not being connected to suffering in that way.
What is your connection to suffering? Just not feeling it?
My connection to suffering is, I think I said it before, I avoid it like the plague.
Avoiding, that sounds kind of painful.
That's not so bad. I mean, particularly other people's suffering. I avoid other people's suffering. Some people might think of that as a shallow and callous way to be, but that's what I've got right now. That's what is for me. That's what is as it is here and now. I really have no interest in hearing people's stories of their pain and suffering.
Well, yeah, hearing their stories about pain and suffering that might be luxury suffering, I could certainly see that as being not of interest. But I know that you are there for some people, that there are people who are struggling that you support and help and care about. At least that's been my perception.
Yeah. We might leave out the word care. Support, yes, but caring, I was like, I don't know. That's my dilemma.
Mm.
I don't care. But for some reason, that's not a problem either for me.
Well, I'm not saying this is true in your case at all, but when you say that, I think about how not caring can be a big defense for people.
Yeah, I agree. That could be me to a T, a total armament. But the funny thing is, things like that, I have no interest in pursuing that in terms of like, is that true or is it not true? Trying to like stalk that thing down and hunt it down like a tiger and kill it. That's how I see myself. That's how I relate to the world. And if something shows up that alters my perspective on that, alters that trajectory, then I can go with that, maybe. But I'm not going to pursue looking for something different or looking whether something is a real problem or not for me. Even an impediment on the spiritual path is what you're implying.
Not necessarily.
Oh, I thought you were.
Like that's not anything that I could say anything about. But I notice in myself that sometimes, these really early childhood things come up that I used to say to myself. I notice that I'd say them sometimes. Like all of a sudden something will happen. I'll mutter under my breath, I don't care. And that goes way back. But I understood that was a way of keeping myself from pain. And it just seemed to fit here in the discussion. How any of this all applies is really up to us. What I do really appreciate is your genuineness and your openness about what's real for you and everyone who's spoken tonight. And to me, we have different kinds of talks. Sometimes it's about presenting information. Sometimes it goes deeper. And I just felt the discussion tonight went, pretty deep.
I'll just say, I feel that we've just opened up the discussion. We really have opened it up.
Matthew, anything to wrap up?
No. That was good. It was fun.